At school, Frank is transferred to a new class and accidentally gets mistaken for a substitute French teacher. Instead of correcting the mistake, he walks to the front of the classroom and begins teaching. The students listen to him for an entire week before the school finally discovers he is only a student. The incident shows just how easily Frank can convince people when he acts confidently. As time passes, problems begin appearing inside the Abenel household. Frank Sr. starts having serious tax issues with the government. His business struggles, and the family is forced to leave their large house and move into a much smaller home. Frank watches his father become increasingly stressed while trying to keep everything together. One day, Frank notices his mother spending time with a family friend named Jack Barnes. The two appear much closer than they should be. Frank keeps what he sees to himself, but the situation continues bothering him. The problems at home become impossible to hide when Frank's parents announce they are separating. The situation eventually reaches divorce court. During the hearing, the judge asks Frank whether he wants to live with his mother or father. Unable to choose between them, Frank suddenly gets up and runs from the courthouse. Instead of going home, Frank disappears. He begins living alone with very little money. At first, he survives by cashing small checks, but he quickly realizes he needs a better way to support himself. One day, he notices airline pilots walking through an airport. Everyone treats them with respect. Hotels provide them with rooms. Flight attendants admire them. Nobody questions where they go. Frank decides to become one. He researches Pan Am pilots and creates fake identification. He visits a uniform company and convinces them to provide him with parts of a pilot uniform. Piece by piece, he assembles an entire outfit. Once he puts it on, people immediately begin treating him differently. Frank starts forging payroll checks and cashing them at banks. The uniform makes bank employees trust him. The checks work, and before long he is collecting thousands of dollars. To travel around the country without paying for flights, Frank learns about a system used by airline crews called deadheading. Pilots can occupy unused seats on flights while traveling between assignments. Using his fake pilot identity, Frank flies across America for free. As his confidence grows, the forged checks become larger and more sophisticated. Banks continue accepting them, and Frank begins living in expensive hotels while traveling from city to city. Meanwhile, FBI agent Carl Hanratty is assigned to investigate the growing number of fraudulent checks appearing across the country. Carl studies the evidence and realizes all the checks are connected to the same person. One day, Carl tracks Frank to a hotel room. When he arrives, Frank is standing there wearing a suit. Thinking quickly, Frank pretends to be a Secret Service agent investigating the case himself. He introduces himself under a fake name and starts asking Carl questions. Carl becomes confused and briefly believes him. By the time Carl realizes something is wrong, Frank has already escaped. Humiliated by the encounter, Carl becomes determined to catch him. Frank continues traveling around the country, posing as a Pan Am pilot while cashing forged checks. Newspapers begin reporting on the mysterious fraudster. Law enforcement agencies across different states start searching for him, but Frank constantly stays one step ahead. Eventually, Carl discovers Frank's real age through school records. The revelation shocks him. The man responsible for millions of dollars in fraud isn't an experienced criminal mastermind. He's still a teenager. Frank later arrives in Georgia and decides it is becoming too risky to continue posing as a pilot. He starts looking for a new identity. While visiting a hospital, he notices how much authority doctors have. Once again, he decides to become one. Using forged credentials, Frank introduces himself as Dr. Frank Connors and quickly secures a position supervising medical residents at a hospital. Although he has no medical training whatsoever, he carefully avoids situations that would expose him. He spends most of his time observing other doctors and allowing them to handle patients while he stays in the background. During his time at the hospital, Frank meets a young nurse named Brenda Strong. The two quickly become close and begin spending time together. Meanwhile, Carl follows another lead and arrives in Georgia. His investigation slowly brings him closer to Frank's location. One evening, Carl tracks Frank to the hospital residence. Frank notices him approaching and immediately realizes who he is. Carl enters the building and begins searching room by room. Frank escapes through a window moments before Carl reaches him. Carl arrives too late once again. Frank leaves Georgia and continues running. After escaping Georgia, Frank continues using different identities while staying ahead of the FBI. He keeps in contact with Brenda and eventually returns to see her again. Their relationship grows quickly, and before long, Frank is spending time with her family. Brenda's parents welcome him into their home, believing he is a successful doctor with a bright future. Frank enjoys being around them because it reminds him of the family life he lost after his parents divorced. During dinner one evening, Brenda's father asks Frank about his career and future plans. Frank confidently answers every question and continues playing the role perfectly. As the relationship becomes more serious, Frank realizes he can no longer continue pretending to be a doctor forever. He soon creates another identity. This time, Frank decides to become a lawyer. He studies legal books and spends weeks learning everything he can. Using forged documents, he lands a position at the Louisiana Attorney General's office. Nobody suspects that the young lawyer working beside them was recently pretending to be a pilot and a doctor. Frank now spends his days working as an attorney while continuing to forge checks across the country. The fraud operation becomes larger than ever, and the FBI finds itself chasing leads in multiple states at the same time. Meanwhile, Carl spends countless hours studying Frank's movements. He notices a pattern and begins learning more about Frank's family. During his investigation, Carl visits Frank's father. Frank Sr. immediately recognizes that Carl is searching for his son. Although he doesn't know where Frank is, he refuses to help the FBI. Carl leaves empty-handed but realizes that Frank still cares deeply about his father. As Christmas approaches, Carl remains at work while most of the office goes home to celebrate with family. Late that night, the phone rings. To Carl's surprise, it's Frank. Instead of taunting him, Frank simply starts talking. The two discuss Christmas and exchange a few words before hanging up. The conversation is short, but Carl realizes something important. Frank didn't call to brag about escaping. He called because he had nobody else. A year later, the same thing happens again. Another Christmas Eve. Another phone call. This time, Carl uses the conversation to gather information about Frank's location. Frank eventually realizes what Carl is doing and immediately hangs up. The relationship between them continues becoming stranger. Carl is still trying to arrest him, but after years of chasing him across the country, he understands Frank better than anyone else. Meanwhile, Frank proposes to Brenda. She happily accepts. For the first time since running away from home, Frank begins imagining a normal future. He talks about marriage, a house, and a life together. Brenda has no idea that almost everything she knows about him is a lie. Carl eventually discovers Brenda's connection to Frank and tracks her down. The FBI arrives at her house. Frank is inside when he notices agents approaching the property. Carl enters the house and finally comes face to face with him. This time, there is no easy escape. Carl calmly explains that he knows Frank's real identity and tells Brenda's family the truth. Brenda is shocked as she learns that the man she planned to marry is not a doctor, lawyer, or pilot. Frank convinces Brenda to meet him later at a bus station so they can run away together. She agrees. Frank then escapes through a bathroom window before the agents can stop him. Carl discovers the escape moments later. Frank arrives at the bus station expecting to run away with Brenda. He spots her waiting inside. He notices FBI agents positioned around the station. Realizing the meeting was a trap, Frank turns around and drives away before the agents can reach him, disappearing once again. With the FBI closing in from all directions, Frank decides to leave the United States. He travels across Europe and continues cashing forged checks in different countries. Meanwhile, Carl follows him from one lead to another. Eventually, Carl discovers that Frank is hiding in France. He contacts French authorities and provides them with Frank's location. One morning, French police surround Frank and arrest him. The chase that lasted years is finally over. Frank is transported to a French prison. The conditions are terrible. The man who once lived in luxury hotels now finds himself locked inside a small cell with almost nothing. Carl arrives in France and visits him. For the first time, Frank has nowhere to run. After spending time in French custody, Frank is extradited back to the United States.
Frank is sentenced to prison and transferred to a maximum security facility. The freedom he enjoyed for years disappears overnight. No more luxury hotels, no more first-class flights, and no more fake identities. His days are now spent behind bars, with strict routines and constant supervision. Carl continues checking in on him from time to time. Unlike the officers guarding him, Carl understands exactly how Frank thinks and knows he is too intelligent to simply sit in a prison cell forever. During one visit, Carl shows Frank a stack of counterfeit checks and asks for his opinion. Frank immediately spots mistakes that experienced investigators failed to notice. He points out printing flaws, signatures, and security issues within seconds. Carl begins realizing that Frank's greatest value isn't as a criminal sitting in prison, but as someone who understands fraud better than almost anyone else. As the years pass, the FBI offers Frank an opportunity. He can help them identify counterfeit checks and financial scams in exchange for reduced prison restrictions. Frank accepts and begins working inside an FBI office under supervision. At first, everything feels strange. Instead of creating fake checks, he is now helping agents stop the people making them. Frank proves extremely useful almost immediately. Whenever investigators bring him forged documents, he quickly explains how the criminals created them and how they can be traced. The agents are impressed by how much knowledge he has gained from years of experience. Despite the new opportunity, Frank struggles with his new life. For years, he lived by making decisions for himself, traveling wherever he wanted, and constantly staying ahead of everyone chasing him. Now he works regular hours, follows rules, and spends most of his time sitting behind a desk. One weekend, while working in the office alone, Frank notices that security around him has become much more relaxed. Nobody is watching him closely. Nobody is stopping him. For the first time in a long time, he realizes he has a chance to escape. Frank leaves the building and makes his way toward the airport. The familiar surroundings bring back memories of his years pretending to be a pilot. Meanwhile, Carl receives a call informing him that Frank is gone. The FBI trusts him. They need him. Frank finally realizes that for the first time since he ran away from home, somebody is actually giving him a chance instead of trying to arrest him. Rather than boarding a plane, Frank returns. Back at the FBI, Frank continues helping investigators solve fraud cases. His role gradually expands, and he becomes an important part of the team. The agents who once viewed him as a criminal begin respecting his expertise. The partnership between them continues growing stronger, and their unlikely relationship remains one of the most important parts of both their lives.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.